I don't know if you heard, but now former Nintendo President of America, Reggie Fils-Aimé, made a Twitter account. And though I doubt this will be happening much in the future, we may have gotten some news out of it. As part of a series of posts that Reggie made during his trip down memory lane as he packed up his office on his last day at Nintendo of America, he tweeted out this particular picture with gifts from colleagues at Nintendo that were given to him for his retirement. The potential news comes from the main focus of this image being a painting from the team over at Retro Studios of Reggie alongside characters from the games that they worked on. One of these characters is obscured, and that of course sent everyone on the internet into speculation mode. But why does this matter so much? Why is everybody so hungry to know what Retro Studios is working on? For this video, that's exactly the question I seek to answer. I want to dive into the history of Retro Studios to try to figure out what makes them so important. As some of you may know from my series of videos where I looked at what Nintendo Studios could be up to, founded on September 21st, 1998, Retro Studios was a collaborative effort between Nintendo and Jeff Spangenberg, the founder of the now defunct Iguana Entertainment, which was a studio mostly known for the creation of Turok. Retro had a phenomenal start with a top-of-the-line staff of about 120 people, which quickly ballooned to over 200 people, but we'll get to that, boasting collected experience from companies like ILM, LucasArts, id Software, and Valve. Nintendo funded a 40,000 square foot studio to house them in with, at the time, state-of-the-art tech like a motion tracking stage, one of the first of its kind in Austin, Texas. That said, all of this money Nintendo was dumping into the studio was getting them nowhere fast. Out of the 5 teams that were working on projects, only the technology team meant for building tools and engines. The other 4 teams were used to create the 4 planned GameCube launch titles was making any progress, which, as you'd imagine, isn't very helpful. After seeing 2 years come and go without any real progress, Nintendo, more specifically Nintendo of Japan, finally stepped in. Out of the 4 games being worked on, Nintendo didn't approve of any due to them not following Nintendo's tried and true design philosophies. However, Shigeru Miyamoto did see promise in one, a game tentatively titled Action Adventure. Miyamoto had been thinking of ways to bring Metroid into the modern age with a first-person shooter in the Metroid universe anyway, and he felt that with some additional work and focus, Action Adventure could be a solid foundation for Retro to make just that. This resulted in a large portion of Retro staff being laid off in an effort to consolidate for their new role as a one-game studio. Turns out, Retro founder Jeff Spangenberg was included in these layoffs due to his conduct outside of the company, and, well, as Retro was falling apart in those early days, he was MIA. Nintendo bought out his shares in the company for $1 million, going from their previous stake of 15 million shares to 70 million shares, and Spangenberg was replaced with Steve Barcia, who previously founded a computer game company probably none of you heard of called Simtex Software. While it certainly was an improvement, it definitely wasn't an immediate fix. Metroid Prime's development was plagued with several internal delays, which resulted in some less than ideal working conditions with a bunch of crunch. Employees facing mandatory overtime requiring them to work upwards of 12 hours a day for nearly a year of the game's development. This isn't exactly uncommon in the industry, but for Nintendo, it's far from the norm, with their company average today being under 8 hours a day. However, it worked out for them, obviously, with Metroid Prime's release greatly exceeding expectations, both critically, with its reception still ranking amongst the highest on Metacritic for games with a 97. It was believed that Nintendo planned to shut down the studio after the release of Metroid Prime due to the numerous problems they faced with Retro in the years leading up to Metroid Prime's release, but the game's success clearly changed their minds. You would think this is where things would start to get better for Retro, and from the outside looking in, they did. There's another however in here though. However, company culture wasn't improving, and a lot of Retro staff wasn't happy about it. Compensation was unfairly scaled, with higher-ups receiving the bulk of the money rewarded through bonuses, which again doesn't sound out of the ordinary, but Retro Studios was made up of some of the most talented game devs in the world, especially after those layoffs that I mentioned in the lead up to Metroid Prime, only leaving the top tier talent at the studio. In a world where all of these employees could easily be considered the best of the best and paid like it at any other company, why stay at Retro in its current state? So people plan to leave en masse. After hearing this, as I'm sure we could all understand, Nintendo wasn't exactly pleased. They had finally gotten a hit game out of a studio that they invested so much money in and was in the red for so long. In an effort to appease those working at the studio, they replaced Steve Barcia with Michael Kelba, who at the time was Nintendo's director of business development and is still Retro Studios' president to this day. As we know, Nintendo asked Retro to make a sequel to Metroid Prime as they were pleased with its commercial and critical reception. Retro aimed to create a bigger and better game without merely recycling the elements that made the original great. They created all new assets, implemented features they scrapped from Prime 1 due to time constraints, and added a multiplayer mode. The collaborative nature of this game's development is also very interesting to me. After deciding to stray away from established storytelling norms in the Metroid series, for Prime 2, Retro wanted to instead center the story around a theme of light versus dark. While working on the game's plot, the team at Retro consulted with producers of The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past for advice due to their game also making use of parallel worlds. Another major departure Retro aimed to make with Prime 2 contrasts pretty nicely with the way Nintendo approaches game development in the modern age. They wanted to make Prime 2 more challenging. They felt that Prime 1 already served the purpose of familiarizing players with the mechanics, so Prime 2 was meant to challenge that familiarity, and it worked out. Metroid Prime 2 Echoes became yet another commercial and critical success for Retro and Nintendo, scoring a 92 on Metacritic. The development of Prime 3 was similar to the first two games in the series in two very distinct ways in my mind. It shared the distinction of being positioned as a console-defining game for the Wii, much in the way Prime 1 was for the GameCube, as well as the obvious connection in my mind with Prime 2 in the sense that Retro wanted to one-up their last attempt. This also worked, with Metroid Prime 3 Corruption receiving critical acclaim, once more scoring a 90 on Metacritic. Soon after, like Parker said in one of his recent videos, senior producer Brian Walker suggested Retro compile all of their Prime games on one disc for fans. Kelba sent a proposal to Nintendo, they approved, and it was released 2 years later. During the development of Prime Trilogy, 3 more key employees made their departure from Retro Studios to form Armature Studios. Despite this, when Miyamoto asked for recommendations on studios that could create a new Donkey Kong game, Kensuke Tanaba, the producer for the bulk of the Metroid Prime series, recommended Retro Studios CEO Michael Kelba for the job as he had experience with Donkey Kong Country during his time at Nintendo of America. A few key themes they followed during the development was their aim to invoke a sense of nostalgia for Nintendo's classic games through its visual and audio design, while introducing new gameplay elements in the same way the new Super Mario Bros. Series does, and to be accessible while also challenging players just enough to make them want to try again when they fail. Donkey Kong Country Returns became Retro's most successful game commercially, going on to sell well over 4 million copies on Wii and over 1.5 million additional copies when it was ported to 3DS. Although it's worth noting that Retro didn't handle the port for this game, a studio called Monster Games did. While it didn't quite reach the critical acclaim of the Prime series, it did do pretty well in that realm, receiving an 88 on Metacritic. After they wrapped up development on Returns, 2 more key departures happened at Retro, with 2 senior designers leaving the company. During the period that immediately followed the original DKCR release, Retro undertook a supportive role for Mario Kart 7, which they co-developed due to Nintendo having the bulk of their staff at their main studio, working on Nintendogs Plus Cats, Skyward Sword, and other things. Originally, Retro was only supposed to produce remakes of classic courses, but they used this opportunity as a learning experience to create their own custom levels that impressed EPD enough to also have them implemented into the game. After wrapping up their work on Mario Kart 7, Retro began work on Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, with Kelba citing the team's unused ideas that they couldn't make work on their first Donkey Kong game. They used Wii U's extra horsepower to toy around with dynamic camera angles, implement enhanced fur effects, and unlike the original Retro-helmed Donkey Kong game, they handled the port to Nintendo Switch, wherein they included the funky mode, easy mode, and some new animations here and there. For most of the existence of Retro Studios, they've been pretty consistent, yielding about one game every every 2 to 3 years. That said, it's been quite a bit longer than that since their last original project. It's hard for me to believe that they've just been twiddling their thumbs for the years that followed Tropical Freeze. And it's honestly even harder for me to believe that it took them more than a few months at most to port Tropical Freeze from Wii U to Switch. So it's reasonable to believe that something was in the works for that time. The question is, what was it, and will we still see it? The current rumors suggest it's a Star Fox racing game called Star Fox Grand Prix. That wouldn't be too surprising. It would fit the studio in more ways than one, given the fact that Star Fox was a product of a similar meeting of the minds between American and Japanese developers, and much like Metroid Prime ended up being, it was a series that Nintendo used to showcase the best their tech could offer. This is a familiar set of circumstances for Retro, and I think if this ends up being what they are working on, there's no better studio to make it work. They changed Metroid from a 2D platformer to a first-person shooter, so it wouldn't be inconceivable to see them successfully reinvent Star Fox as well. Also, it was recently revealed that their next project will be Prime 4, and despite the fact that some of the key members of the team that worked on the original Prime trilogy have since moved on to work for other studios, the core of the company is still very much intact. A lot of people seem to believe that the loss of talent at Retro leaves them as a shell of their former self, incapable of creating the games that we grew to know and love them for. But I'd argue that's inaccurate in a lot of different ways. For one, Retro Studios came into its own through those initial layoffs, so there's precedent that shows that sometimes you need to trim the fat to get to the meat. Also, this line of thinking greatly undersells the role that Nintendo's direction has in this company's successes. Them reallocating talent in the way that they did for Retro's current president from a pretty important part of Nintendo of America to right the ship at Retro, or in the way they continue to lend talent from EPD to assist in production, says to me that they believe in them as a studio. It's even been directly stated from Tanabe that Nintendo relies on them to create games that the Japanese studios can't. That should mean something to Nintendo fans. Nintendo doesn't approach development through acquisitions of existing brands like Sony or Microsoft do. Almost all of their software output comes out of their internal teams in Japan, more specifically EPD. I would say that all of the effort they put into Retro and continue to put into Retro shows that they value that team a lot, and I believe that's due in large part to the contrast they offer them. The Western world approaches game development differently, so I would say it's certainly important for Nintendo to have a prominent Western dev, but what makes Retro even more special amongst all other Western developers is their ability to not only apply Western norms to their game design, but to take that and meld it with the design principles that make Nintendo stand out amongst the rest of the industry. And that's an abridged history of Retro Studios. I hope that this video taught you something that you may have not known about one of Nintendo's most important studios. This is another thing I wanted to try, doing a deep dive into one specific team at Nintendo. So if you enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you let me know in the comments, and definitely by clicking the like button and sharing the video. If you enjoyed this and any of the other stuff that we make here, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. Follow me on Twitter, but most importantly, what you can do to help out this channel is subscribe and ring the bell for more videos like this every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. New podcasts every Saturday, linked in the description and in the card that you're seeing right now. Okay, that's it for me. See you next week.